Hi, this is Sean Wildermuth with Coding Shorts. Today I'm going to go in a completely different direction. Instead of covering things like C# or .NET, or even a JavaScript frameworks like Vue, I'm going to talk about static site generation and a tool I've been using called Eleventy. If you haven't been exposed to static site generation, this should give you a clue to what it's all about, and I'll talk a little bit about why I use it. And I'll introduce you to Eleventy, which is a good framework for doing it. Let's get started. And so here we have a project that I have, Twain Films. This is where all the different films I'm making are. And there's not a whole lot of dynamic content here. And this is actually the same for my blog. These are both projects that I've built using static site generation. And I've done this very specifically because most of this content doesn't have dynamicness to it. Now, it doesn't mean that I can't have single page applications working on these. In fact, my contact page is a little Vue project that I've done with this. So the idea behind static site generation is simply to take the data you have in whatever form you have it and to go ahead and generate all the raw HTML. So there's no server-side generation. It's just serving files ultimately. And there's a lot of different solutions for doing this. There's a .NET one called Static with a Q that I quite like, though I found it a little harder to work with than the one I'm going to show you today, Eleventy. And there's also some really big projects. If you're in the Vue or the React world, you're probably used to Next and Nux, which are also static file generators. There's even Gatsby and Hugo, a lot of these, and they have really different approaches. A lot of the ones I started working with, I ran into the wall of they had sort of a prescriptive way that they wanted them to work, and I didn't want them to work that way. And what I like about Eleventy is it's really, really simple, and you can get started with what you want pretty quickly. So in Visual Studio Code, I'm just in a folder I'm calling Demo, and I'm going to just initialize it as an NPM project. And essentially all that does is create a package.json for me. There's no packages installed, nothing. And I'm also going to want to install @11ty, which is the shortening version of Eleventy, and then it's also called Eleventy, but spelled out. And in this way, the @11ty is sort of a placeholder for a number of projects that might be related to it. But this is the main project, and I'm just going to say save dev because it's a development time, not a runtime project. We're only going to be running, in this case, a JavaScript function during development and building. We're never going to deploy with any of this JavaScript in there. And there we're done. I'm going to cut out how slow or fast that was. Your mileage may vary. And I'm just going to go and create a new file here in my project. I'm going to call index.html. Not a really clever or interesting thing, and I'm going to use the HTML5 just to give me some boilerplate. And down here, I'm just going to create a h1. This is generated, right? And if I go to the sort of debug experience we want, which is Eleventy serve, this is going to generate the files and then wait for changes. In the case of Eleventy, any changes it sees are going to regenerate the entire site. It doesn't yet do incremental compilation, so that's something to be aware of. And often the way these things work, a single file changing may actually impact quite a lot. And so if we go to this site, you shouldn't be surprised at all that it's generating this. And what do we mean by generated? In the project, once we build this, whether through serve or actually just running Eleventy, it's going to create a underscore site folder by default that has taken this file and processed it. Of course, this file is going to be identical because we haven't really done anything, right? We just say this is an HTML file, and Eleventy knows that we want to process this, but we haven't given it anything to process yet. So let's close the one that's in sight because that one will be regenerated. In fact, since I'm going to be running this from time to time, I'm just going to go ahead and add it to my package, and I'll call this dev, and I'll just do the same thing I just did. I'll say Eleventy serve, just so we can have it in a script in case we need to add more stuff later. So I'll go down here and just run dev, right? It's going to do the same thing it did before, and I'm just going to close this for now because we want to start looking at where we're getting the data for a particular page. And so The one thing you'll notice in a lot of these projects is that it's using these headers that include data in them. So I'm going to create it, and this is using YAML, though you can use JavaScript or JSON if you're more comfortable. And I'm just going to say this is the home page. Just some piece of text there. And so it's going to take whatever data is there and allow us to use, by default it's using Liquid, which is a double curly braced based sort of markup language, and I can just say title here, right? And I'll do it here as well, just so we can know it's being used in a couple places, and this is a generated page. And so after I make that change, if we go over here to index, what are we getting? We're getting that data just shoved into these two places for us. And this sort of implies the really simple way that this stuff works. And the Liquid language you have here can be changed for a couple of different ones. I use nunjucks a lot, and I'll show you how that works in a little bit. But this data can come from multiple places. But let's first just make a value for colors. And I'm going to use the YAML syntax for a collection and just say blue, red, green, right? Just some 3-valued. And then I can use a syntax that might be similar to what you would do in Razor and just say for C in colors, or let's call it colors. Color in colors. And I'll need to do an end for here as well. Make sure you put those percentages on both sides. And then all I need to do is just say color, right? This is just the simple sort of if for other sort of structures that most languages would need. This is just a markup language. So I'm going to start with an unordered list. I have my LIs here. I'm going to save it. Now we can see that it's generate the data, the information based on that data, right? Not that interesting, because if we can put it up here, we could certainly have put it down here, right? There's not a magic piece to this on having data here that is also down here. But this is sort of to get your whistle wet on how that works. Let's talk about it in a little more specific terms. So I'm going to create a new folder here called _data. And that is a folder that can contain information you're actually going to base your project around, right? And so what does this data actually look like? If in here I create a new file, and I'll call it site.json, though this could be JavaScript as well, but I'll assume it's JSON, and I'll put name, site name, testing Eleventy, right? Because this is in the special folder they call data, and this could be JavaScript that goes and reaches into a database, this could be any sort of ways you want to get data, we can do that. And then if I come back here, I don't need to do anything with the header here because all the data structures up here flow through. And so I can actually come in here and say site.site name, right? It got the site from the name of the file, and then the site name was the property I put in there. And if we come back here, we'll see it's actually failing. And the reason is, as I was typing this, it crashed. So let's go ahead and just run that again. So if we come back to the browser, it might be a little hard to see here, but it says testing Eleventy before the rest of the home page there, because we're able to take that data from generic places and do something with it. But not all the data you're going to want to work with here is necessarily static data or even data you're going to generate with a file. Another special directory that you're going to want to get used to is _includes. Now this is going to allow you to sort of break up your pages in the way you want it to, but what we want to actually do is create a new file here called layout, and I'm going to use njk for the extension because I want it to use nunjucks. That's the only way it knows these different templating libraries. I could also say liquid and it would use liquid instead. But I'm more familiar with NJK, so I'm going to do that. And the layout here is allowing us to create sort of that master page. So let's copy all of this file for index and put it in our layout. But we don't actually want what's in here to be in the layout. We want to be able to say, bind the content, and we're going to use the word here, safe. These are what are called filters, and there's a safe filter to make sure that the content that's inside of there is actually safe to render. Now I've done this, but nothing is new. In fact, you'll see that in the site, there's still an index.html file. Let's go back to the original one and erase everything but the data that we're actually using, right? We still have all of this, but let's add a property here for layout, layout.njk. And in this case, we can see we're getting that data here in the home page, that this is still working because it's using this layout here to take the body of what's here and put it into the layout. And a couple of things are interesting here. You'll notice that, you'll notice it got the title and the site name the way we'd expect, but of course we have the title up here. Let's get rid of all this unless we have some specific data that's specific to layout. And when we come back here, we'll see that the title is still being used. This is the home page, right? And that's because data that is used here on the page flows down into the layout so that you can use that as well. Now the body of this ends up being content, but this starts to give you a sense of how you would go ahead and create a more structured or modular developing of a website. But most of what you're going to do isn't like this, right? You aren't going to be creating single files that are just using some random data. You want to actually create pages. And so let's pretend we're creating a blog. And so I'm going to create a folder I'm just going to call blog. And this isn't special. This is part of the name that you're going to care about. And let's create a couple of other subfolders over here. Let's say 2022. What is today? 09. A new folder 22. And then finally in here, we'll create a new file. I'll call it, this is my first blog entry.html, or actually MD, right? A lot of what we're going to be dealing with is we want to be able to have this site, but use maybe Markdown to create all of that. And that's certainly supported here. So we may have some special things here, like what the title of this blog entry is, so that it can be used in other places. And so I'll just call this my first blog. And down here, I'll welcome to my blog. And I'll just do, this is blog post. See how normal Markdown works. This is code 2, right? I have this very simple piece here. And when I save it, one of the things you'll notice is there's now a blog directory inside the site. It has seen pieces here, and it's used the directory to imply what the URL is. And then this index.html is what we actually wrote, going from Markdown to the actual code. So this is interesting, but this plain old piece here is not exactly what we want. So I'm going to come here, and I could do layout and say layout.njk, right? And then what we would get here in our blog is going to be more like what we saw, the code we generated in this static format. And notice that it put it in index.html at that entry, right? Well, why did it do this? Because we want to use, by default, naked URLs. So by going to blog 2002, etc., name of my blog, it's going to pull up what? The default index. So we don't have to have index as part of our entry here, right? But I'm probably going to have a lot of these pieces for blog, and I don't want to have to put this layout in every one. And this is another thing that it does that's quite interesting. So let's go up to the data directory, and I'm going to create a new file. I'm going to call layout.js. And here I can say module.exports equals, And all I'm going to do is export a string. And what is that string going to be? It's going to be layout.njk. And this is going to, by default, make sure that everyone has our layout information coming from the module. And so once I save that, if I've done this right, you'll see that we're getting all of that layout in here without us having to actually define it in our header here. In fact, we don't need to define it in our index.html either. We can just get rid of that entirely. And you can have these overwritten at folder levels as well. So I might have a layout that derives from the layout.njk that is just for all my blog pages. But here's the interesting thing. I can then go back to my original, get rid of all these, my original page where I was doing this 4 colors. I'm just going to comment that out. And let's do the same thing here, another UL. And then here I want to say for entry in collections.all. What does that mean? By default, what collections as a sort of shared variable does is allows you to look at every page that is being generated and being able to put it here. So let's do li entry.data.title. Now, where does this data.title come from? Every page that exposes that header has a title, and this is only called title because by convention, we've told it that title needs to be on each one of these pages, right? We get this is my home page and my first blog. Well, I didn't want this page to be included in there. I might want to only have some subset like my actual blog entry. So what do we do there? We can actually come over here and pick where we're getting this data. Now, this isn't going to magically get it from the folder. What we have to do is tell it that we have a tag, and each entry here can have multiple tags, but I'm just going to call this blogs. Whatever I put here is going to create a collection based on these tags. So you could mix and match how you do these things. But since this is it says now blogs, we're only getting this first blog. And we can make this sort of that first page by going ahead and making this a hyperlink. Using that same syntax, I can just say entry.url, which is an implicit value on each of the things in here in order to create that href. And let's come back up here to our layout, and let's just make sure that before our content here, let's just have a h3 home, just so we have a way to get back and forth there. This is going to be generated on each and every page above the content. So let's put an HR here just to make it a little prettier. Come back here, we can see that this is sort of our pseudo menu, and that this is going to allow us to go to our page and then home. And what you can see here in the URL is that it's not creating an URL for a specific .html file that it generated, but really just for the way to get to that page, in this case with naked URLs. So I've just touched on the bare minimum here. It's a lot here that can be configured. There's a way to add an Eleventy configuration file and tell it where the data is. Often I'll have a input folder as well as outputting to site so that I can separate them a little more, because here it ends up becoming a little busy. I like the site to be sort of on its own. And you can see some of these examples. I'll link them in the show notes below to see more fleshed out projects like my blog, for instance. Hope I've given you a taste of Eleventy and maybe made you sort to think about projects where you don't need that dynamic server-side rendering. This is a great way to build the site, have it hosted in something like Azure Static Apps, which is a great solution for files because there's no server code running at all. And when you need more interaction, you can have single-page applications or JavaScript or TypeScript call out into the APIs to do some of that stuff that you would normally do in the browser. Not a solution for every project, and certainly not something I would replace ASP.NET with, But for certain cases, my film site, my blog, where most of it is just data-driven data, I'm just sharing information. I'm not collecting much information. I find this a really easy way to do it without having to have a really high-powered server that has to handle all this. These are just files somewhere in Azure that when there's a request made, it returns those files. We're moving all that generation to the build cycle, not at runtime. And that's one of the reasons I like it. Well, if you've made it this far, I appreciate it. And if you liked it, please like and subscribe. I have to say that. That's part of the deal. I'll be talking about some C# things coming up soon, so subscribe to be notified about those and ask questions in the comments. I'm happy to try to clarify some things. I'll see you next time on Coding Shorts.